Have you ever noticed that part of you seems to resist the very things that you say that you want, like success, opportunity, growth, and progression? And the moment your life starts opening up and you start to get closer to achieving your goals, that's when something in you tightens up and resists progressing to the next level. And you procrastinate, you self-sabotage, you hold yourself back, you focus on the wrong things, and you get overwhelmed, and you even start to wonder if it's a fear of failure. But in actuality, it's the exact opposite thing. You're not afraid of failure, you're actually afraid of success. And in this video, I'm going to reveal to you one of the most common underlying root causes that makes the nervous system respond to success as something dangerous. Now, before we discuss where the fear of success comes from at the root, one of the things that I wanted to mention is that fear of success isn't actually a real thing. Nobody fears success. Really, what they fear is what success comes along with. So we're always afraid of the side effects that come along with success, not the success itself. For example, someone can be afraid of success because it might make a sibling jealous or, something of that nature, but it's really about the fear of making the sibling jealous and not the success itself. Or maybe somebody else fears success because everyone starts to expect a lot more from them. And really, it's not a fear of success, it's a fear of having a lot of expectation and then disappointing those expectations of others. So to say there's fear of success isn't 100% accurate. And so we're always thinking about what are those side effects that come along with success that we're really afraid of. And there tend to be three main side effects that people are afraid of that are associated with more success. One is that there's more exposure associated with success, more eyeballs on you. Another is that success tends to come with more power, and more power comes with more responsibility. And so people can fear the responsibility that comes with success. And the third is that there's more expectations when somebody's been successful. And so if somebody's been successful, maybe other people start expecting more of them. And so that fear of others' expectations comes from the fear of disappointing others. And with all three of these reasons, whether it be greater responsibility, greater expectation, or greater exposure, all three of those really boil down to one main underlying root cause for the fear of success. And that root cause is a pattern that usually starts in childhood, where a person hyper-internalizes responsibility for that which is outside of the scope of their control. And so if you fear success, there's a high likelihood that you felt responsible as a child for things that were beyond the scope of your control, like your parents' feelings or a chaotic home situation or dynamics that you were impacted by, but you had no power to control them. And so the pattern for a person in this situation becomes that anything within the scope of your awareness becomes part of your responsibility, something to control, even if it's something that you have no leverage over whatsoever. And so for a person who coped that way in childhood and took that tendency to hyper-internalize responsibility over things beyond the scope of their control, power in and of itself is going to feel very, very uncomfortable and dangerous. And because success comes with a greater level of power, and power and responsibility both rise and fall together, or should rise and fall together, what ends up happening is that a greater expansion in power is going to feel like there's going to be this overwhelm of greater responsibility to match up to other people's expectations, greater responsibility to match up to an ideal, greater responsibility to make sure that everybody's happy with what it is that you're doing. And there's a bit of a paradox for somebody who has this coping strategy, because the strategy is all about internalizing responsibility in order to monopolize power, to gain as much control over the situation as possible, because that's what feels safer. But then that's very overwhelming, because it puts you in a very low power, high responsibility state where you take on responsibility for that which you don't have any traction over whatsoever. And so any kind of responsibility then feels like something that you're very aversive to, and power along with it feels like something you're aversive to because of this pattern. And so this pattern is paradoxical in the sense of trying to gain as much responsibility as possible, but also trying to avoid as much responsibility as possible. And we can even think about it like two different aspects of the self. So one part feels safer when there's the illusion of control and responsibility over everything. The other part feels safer when it can push all of the responsibility off of the plate because of the overwhelm that comes from the other coping strategy to internalize all of that responsibility. And there tends to be a belief that makes this pattern run. And I call it a tiger among bunny rabbits belief. It is this belief that you're the tiger and everybody else is a bunch of vulnerable bunny rabbits, and you have to make sure that you tiptoe around them and make sure you keep them happy and make sure that you live up to their standards, because if you as the tiger make even one wrong step, what's going to happen is that the bunny rabbits are going to get hurt. And so if you're in this pattern, it comes from this fundamental belief that you are strong in relation to so many other weak ones. And when you're the strong one in relation to weak ones, what ends up happening is that you try to internalize all of the power and all of the responsibility in order to shield the weak ones from harm. And this creates a sense of added expectations, added responsibility to match up to ideals, while other people just get to exist as they are. And that's why the added expectations and the added responsibilities and the added exposure that comes along with success can really aggravate a lot of wounds for people who have this pattern. Because it's like, oh no, I'm going to become an even more fierce tiger now, and so I'm going to have to be even more careful around all of the bunny rabbits. And the whole thing can feel very overwhelming, and there can be parts of ourselves that just feel more comfortable, like letting go of power, not being too successful, not putting too much on our own plate because we already feel overwhelmed as it is. And so really what makes this tendency operate and that makes success feel very uncomfortable is that there is a sense of being in a low power state with very high responsibility and a tendency to take on more responsibility than our power actually enables us to. So it's taking responsibility for that which is outside of the scope of our control. And this pattern usually originates in childhood, where there's a power and responsibility skew, usually where the parents have more power and less responsibility, and the children have less power and more responsibility. So in this dynamic, you could have a dynamic like a parentified child, where the child was expected to do things beyond what was developmentally appropriate for them in terms of what they took on responsibility-wise. Or if you had one or both parents that had a tendency to not take accountability or externalize responsibility, because there are also hyper-externalizers who want other people to take responsibility for them, then what can happen is you can become an internalizer of responsibility in relation to an externalizer of responsibility. So if you had a parent that was like in victim's mentality or would tend to blow up or blame other people for their problems, then you're more likely to be somebody who hyper internalizes responsibility. And in that case, it's like having too much power at too young of an age and too much responsibility, and it feels very overwhelming. Now, if all of this is resonating with you so far and you want to learn how to unwire at the deepest roots your self-sabotaging behaviors or tendencies to procrastinate, I highly recommend checking out my free webinar that's down in the description box. That's 3 shadow work secrets to get out of your own way and reach your full potential without having to fight yourself. I also have an application down below to work with me if you would like to work with me one-on-one and get more support with being able to resolve the underlying blocks to your self-sabotaging behaviors that hold you back from your full potential. And so power and responsibility are meant to rise and fall together. Otherwise, corruption happens. So a child is meant to have low power and low responsibility. An adult is meant to have higher power and higher responsibility, though still limited in both. But when you have a responsibility skew, what happens is that someone has high power, low responsibility, or low power, high responsibility. So somebody who abuses their power is somebody who has high power but doesn't take a lot of responsibility. And so what happens is that other people around them, in order to cope with that, have to go into a low power, high responsibility state, which is the state that a lot of children get into given the very vulnerable position that children are in. And so if we had a parent that abused their power, or if we had a parent that maybe had certain weaknesses to where they weren't able to match up to the responsibilities of a parent, what ends up happening is that the child ends up internalizing more of that power and responsibility. And then it becomes difficult when it comes to success or any kind of expansion and visibility, because then it's like they're just so used to internalizing that responsibility that they can do it for the whole world. They can feel like they have to be the hero to the whole entire world. And a big part of this pattern, when somebody tends to hyper-internalize a responsibility, is that they don't trust external sources of power and responsibility outside of themselves. They don't expect other people to be strong enough or to have the character enough to take on responsibility for themselves. And so the dark side of this is that somebody who hyper-internalizes responsibility can become an enabler to those who want to externalize responsibility. Or if somebody gets into a position of power who tends to hyper-internalize responsibility, instead of actually delegating out things and like strengthening the team that works under them, what ends up happening is they end up taking power and responsibility away from them, robbing them of opportunities for accountability. And it ends up creating this almost God complex-like intense pressure in on the individual who has the tendency to hyper-internalize responsibility, where they feel like they're the hero that has to save everything. And deeper down, there's a part of them, the part of them that never got to be a child, that just really doesn't want all of that burden, doesn't want all of that power, doesn't want all of that responsibility, and so will tend to push away power and responsibility when faced with the prospect of success. And so if all of this sounds like you, I'm about to tell you what the actual solution is to this. And the solution is quite simple, but can be kind of difficult to do. So the solution is to practice trusting other people and giving back power and responsibility and accountability to other people and trusting them to be able to handle that. And this can be really difficult, especially if we learned that, like, let's say our caregivers were fragile in some way, or we learned that our caregivers would react in a really strong negative emotional way to taking any kind of responsibility for themselves. And this reminds me of a talk that me and a friend of mine had, and they had a very volatile parent, and then whenever like they as a toddler would like ask the parent for something small like an ice cream, the parent would like melt down totally. And so it gave my friend this sense that, oh my gosh, like even just asking for an ice cream cone, I'm too powerful. I'm like causing a full-grown person to totally melt down and to pancake into nothing. And so that is too much power for a child to hold and too much responsibility for a child to hold. And so when it comes to trusting other people to be able to hold responsibility and hold power and to be accountable, that is so challenging. But especially if you're a person who's wanting a promotion into like a higher managerial position, or you're going to be in some kind of leadership position, it is absolutely imperative that you practice handing power and responsibility out over to other people. And that's not just for your own success, but it's also for the greater good of all people. It does no one a service to enable them to shovel off all of their responsibility and power onto you. And so a great exercise for doing this is actually what the serenity prayer refers to. And so that's something like, God, give me the power to change the things that I can, the serenity to accept the things that I can't, and the wisdom to discern the difference between those two things. And that's where that wisdom bit comes in, because it's like being able to notice, what do I not have power over? What's not in my domain to take responsibility for? And then you actually have to put the ball in the other person's court. And when you're able to do this, and when you're able to differentiate those things and to set those boundaries and to internalize responsibility for what's yours, but externalize responsibility for what's not yours, that's when you're able to feel more comfortable wielding more power and more responsibility and being more successful. But if you remain in a state of internalizing responsibility and power over that which is other people's to take responsibility and power over, you continue to maintain that skew where you continue seeing other people as weak and yourself as strong, yourself as capable and others as incapable. And you continue to pile more and more and more responsibilities onto your plate. And you feel like you need to operate a certain way in order to make sure that other people are going to approve or be happy with you. And with more visibility and more exposure, it's going to feel less and less and less and less safe. And so if you are afraid of success, but you want success, all of the success in the world is on the other side of your ability to give power and responsibility back to other people. And a major part of being able to set those boundaries and parse between what's your responsibility and what's the other person's responsibility is all about being able to connect to your sovereignty and being able to answer the question, what do I really want? And so if you want to learn more about that, I highly recommend checking out this video right here.